And as they're leaving the stage, I'd like to make a welcome now to the next speaker, the leader of the Australian Greens, Senator Richard Di Natale, who is joining us and who indeed joined us last year as well. Richard became the leader of the Australian Greens in May 2015, and his parliamentary achievements include securing almost $5 billion toward Medicare-funded dentistry, winning a campaign to divest $250 million worth of tobacco stocks from the Future Fund, spearheading campaigns into many issues of public significance, such as dying with dignity, medicinal cannabis and drug law reform. Prior to entering Parliament, Richard was a general practitioner and public health specialist. His current portfolios include health, multiculturalism and sport. Please join me in welcoming Richard.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Susan. Let me acknowledge you and, of course, all the wonderful work that members of ACFID do and have done over many, many years. I want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nations as the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. You've all come together to talk about human rights in the 21st century, and I had the pleasure of hearing the panel just a moment ago. Well, I think it's about time we got our own house in order. We still haven't come to grips with Australia's founding human rights violation, and that is that the ground on which we stand today was stolen from people who belong to the oldest continuing civilisation on Earth, that we're shaped by the silence surrounding our frontier wars, that violent dispossession is a human rights abuse, that stealing children is a human rights abuse, that erasing language and song is a human rights abuse, and indeed that jailing young kids is a human rights abuse. So every year on January 26, a day that represents the start of centuries of human rights abuses for so many Australians, we're encouraged to celebrate our national holiday. Well, it's about time we change the date we celebrate Australia Day. It's about time we established an Indigenous voice to Parliament. It's about time we endorsed a Makarrata Commission to forge a treaty or treaties with Aboriginal people and to begin the process of healing. It's also about time we end the shame, the abuse that is going on right now with the indefinite imprisonment of innocent people on Manus Island and on Nauru. We can't have a conversation about human rights in this country without having a conversation about what is happening right now under the policies of this government. We've seen people murdered, tortured and abused in offshore detention camps under the so-called care of people like Peter Dutton and Scott Morrison. We've got kids who are starving themselves to death right now. We've got children who are catatonic. We have people who have given up hope. They're suffering from something doctors call resignation syndrome. And it's all because of the decisions of this government, indeed of successive governments. Australia's treatment of refugees matters. It's a matter of life and death for those people who right now are on Manus and Nauru. But it also matters to anyone who has been forced to flee their home through no fault of their own. Indeed, it matters to all those people who might be forced at some point in the future to flee their home. And we are already seeing now countries following Australia's cruel lead. We've got in Italy a government turning boats away with hundreds of African migrants. We've seen Donald Trump citing Australia's approach to refugees in his defence of building a wall. You know, this is what happens when a country deliberately ignores the rule of law and begins to set new global norms. That's what Australia's doing, and that's why countries around the world think it's okay to follow. So we need to be absolutely clear about this. Those people imprisoned on Manus and Nauru, not just children, but men and women, need to be brought to Australia immediately and without delay. It's been not just 5 years too long, but every day we wait is a day too long, and we need to put an end to this stain on Australia's soul. The Greens support the critical role that international institutions play in upholding human rights. We do want Australia to engage positively and constructively with bodies like the Human Rights Council. It's a good thing. We absolutely should be bidding for seats and taking a leadership role. But let's not be hypocrites about it. Let's lift our game. Let's be honest with ourselves. In recent years, we have a dismal foreign policy record and an even worse human rights record. It's a history of laying low, of averting our eyes, of abrogating any responsibility to show leadership on human rights, the rule of law, support for international development, or support for action on climate change. Only a fortnight ago, in the lead up to the Wentworth by-election, we had Prime Minister Scott Morrison's announcement to consider moving the Israeli embassy to Jerusalem. Another sign of Australia's complete capitulation to Donald Trump's erratic and reactionary view of the world. Desperate politics from a desperate government. The government showed it was prepared to ignore the human rights of the Palestinian people, to back a dangerous and unstable US president who is hell-bent on destroying any prospect of a just peace in Israel-Palestine. Even worse, it's cheering of the Israeli Prime Minister's abhorrent policies and actions. Just in raising the prospect of recognising Jerusalem as Israel's capital, we had a Prime Minister offering tacit support for the Israeli government's illegal and inhumane settlement enterprise, the Gaza blockade and its disproportionate use of force. It's not the type of foreign policy Australians want. It's not the type of human rights record that Australians want. Not one where we slavishly follow an erratic madman who seems to govern his country by offensive rants on Twitter at 4 a.m. in the morning. We don't want a government whose foreign policy is going to be dictated to by its prospects of winning a by-election and short-term electoral needs. We want to be advocating foreign policy. We want to be advocating for the rule of law. We want to be advocating for the protection of human rights because it is in the global interest. Let me turn to another foreign policy story of the last few weeks. Jamal Khashoggi, Saudi journalist and writer for the Washington Post, brutally murdered, premeditated, in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. It took weeks for the Foreign Minister to respond to that act. And one of the things that it's allowed us to do is to focus in on the atrocities being perpetrated by the Saudis in Yemen. We've got at least 10,000 Yemenis who have been killed, many going about their ordinary business, kids going to school, attending weddings, people shopping for their groceries. Yemen is on the brink of the world's worst famine in 100 years if the war continues. 13 million people being deliberately starved as a weapon of war. And what's our government's response? Well, the government wants to continue to sell Australian military equipment to Saudi Arabia's National Guard. Former Defence Industry Minister Christopher Pyne, he gloats about the successful sales to war criminals, and he spruiks our plan, our multi-billion-dollar plan, to make Australia a global arms dealer. It's not a choice that a decent country makes. It's not a choice that a country that wants to uphold peace in the region makes. It's not a choice that a country that is committed to upholding human rights takes. It's a contemptible choice. It's an economic plan that's built on the weapons of death rather than one that promotes a sustainable and peaceful future. And it's not in isolation. Our gruesome support of the Saudi regime is one of the many examples of what I've described as a crawling retreat on human rights and development globally. In our own region, the UN has found clear evidence in Myanmar of acts that amount to crimes against humanity and in all likelihood of genocide. Just like last week, we saw the government finally, after repeated demands, not just from us, but from right across the community, to sanction the Myanmar military. Well, they finally announced that they'd sanctioned 5 military officials. It's a welcome development, but it comes years too late. And of course, while we've done that, we continue to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars cooperating with the Myanmar military. The UK, the EU, the US even, they've all decided that working with the military responsible for war crimes, and most likely genocide, is a bridge too far. But not our government, not the Morrison government. In West Papua, our close neighbours are still being denied self-determination nearly 50 years after the Act of No Choice locked in the Indonesian occupation of their ancestral lands. If you're a journalist, you can't get a visa to go to West Papua. If you're a West Papuan, you can be arrested or killed simply for protesting. You can be beaten or murdered if you raise the Morning Star flag in West Papua. Yet, the Australian government continues to provide diplomatic cover for these atrocities. We continue to train the paramilitaries in Indonesia, like Detachment 88, that are implicated in some of the worst of this violence. In China, the government's been largely silent on reports that more than 1 million Uyghur people and other Muslims are being imprisoned in so-called re-education camps. Last week, I had the opportunity to question the Foreign Minister, and we learnt that the government is barred from even visiting the region. In Cambodia, we had those sham elections, yet we still refuse to take any concrete action against what is a murderous and illegitimate Hun Sen regime. Look, I could go on. I'd rather not, and I know you would rather not hear what this government is doing. I could talk about our decision to thumb our nose at the Paris Climate Agreement, which has made us an international pariah and has condemned many of our Pacific neighbours to a future of rising sea levels, severe storms and loss of arable drinking water. But what I really want to focus on in our last few minutes is on one of the most important tools we have to address some of those issues, and that is our aid and development program and the role that it plays in upholding human rights globally. Australia's development program is something we should be so proud of. It's something we should be celebrating in this country. Our NGOs do amazing things to promote human rights. Oxfam has a program supporting Women's Human Rights Defender Network in the Papua New Guinea Highlands. ActionAid's working with mine workers and local communities in South Africa to defend their rights in the face of large multinational mining companies. Of course, you've got many humanitarian agencies who work in crisis and disaster zones to create child-safe spaces, ensure that kids are getting an education. And there's so many examples, you don't need to hear me talk about them. But we should be celebrating the work that you do. This is something we should be exporting to the world. We have the skill, the knowledge, the capacity, the people to do it. And I have to say, the fact that our aid program has been cut so deeply, the fact that it has been gutted by this government in particular, but also by previous governments, it is devastating. It's devastating to me and my party and to many decent Australians right around the country. Of course, you all know that our aid levels reached its lowest point in our history as a proportion of gross national income, and it's happened at a time when the need has never been greater. People ask me about what's my response to it, and you can often argue this in terms of what's in Australia's national interest. And of course, it is in our national interest to ensure that we fund development in the region and across the world. Of course, it's counterproductive to remove aid funding, but it's also morally bankrupt. As a rich, a prosperous, wealthy country, we can and must do more. Of course, the reason you've been told that funding's been cut to such low levels, and I think you heard it from the former Minister from International Development at this very conference, I think it was a couple of years ago, is because you're not doing your jobs properly in selling the virtues of international development. Well, what an insult. What an insult. A comment that said so much more about this government than it says about you. It's not because Australians aren't open-hearted and warm and generous people. I believe they are. I believe they are. It's because this government isn't generous, isn't warm, isn't open-hearted, and doesn't value the work that you do. It's because they're more intent on pandering to xenophobes and racists than standing up for the most vulnerable people in the world. It's because they're more focused on doing the bidding of big corporate donors, like their mates in the defence industry, rather than working towards global peace and disarmament. And you can see it every day in the actions of this government. You see it in an environment minister who peddles the insulting lie to a man who should be awarded an international prize for the work that he's doing, and indeed she insults him by saying, "You're just here for the cash." You see it in a foreign minister who caves into the far right and cuts life-saving support to Australian NGOs who are working in Palestine. You see it in a Prime Minister that continues his attempts to curtail the voices of civil society. Well, the good news is the Liberals look like they're about to be turfed out, and it's not a moment too soon. Let me tell you, it's not a moment too soon. But let's not make, let's be very frank about this. We need the Greens in the Senate to hold a new Labor government to account. It was the ALP who cut the international aid budget to the tune of almost $6 billion by deferring budget commitments. They prized the door open and, of course, the coalition just stormed right through it. We need to have a fair, decent and just commitment to international development. And what that means is a clear commitment and pathway to reaching 0.7% of GNI by 2030. And we proudly make that commitment again to all of you here today. We've got a fully costed plan to deliver on it. It means making choices about raising revenue from those people who can afford it. It means making sure that multinationals no longer treat our tax system as a tax avoidance system. It means making sure that we close loopholes and subsidies that hand out billions of dollars to corporate donors. And if we made those choices, we could have 0.7% of GNI going towards the work that you do that raises people out of poverty and makes their lives better. Governing is all about choices. Our government made a really deliberate choice to slash our international development budget to its lowest levels ever and to pour billions of dollars into increasing our defence budget and supporting some of the most murderous regimes on the planet. Well, we'll continue to call for a different vision for what Australia can and should be. We'll continue to put pressure on a future government, and we hope it will be a Labor government, to get our priorities back on track, to rapidly increase our international aid budget so that we can genuinely play our part in lifting people out of poverty and once again being a force for good when it comes to human rights right across the world. Thanks so much. I'm happy to take a couple of questions.
Thanks, Richard. Claire Rogers from World Vision, CEO. The Kids Off Nauru campaign has built enormous momentum in the Australian public. I think the public didn't really realise what was going on in terms of the outcomes for children. What's your view on all the debating that's going on around the New Zealand deal, you know, the changes to the medical evacuation legislation, all of those things? Do we really have the political will to sort this out? And if not, how do we get it?
Good question. Can I firstly just congratulate World Vision and all of the partners who are part of the campaign to get kids off Nauru. It has been a huge effort, and I have to say your voices have been heard in Parliament, and there's a real shift, I think, in the national mood on this. You know, it has been really tough knowing what's going on and feeling like we're not actually getting this issue into the national debate. And I think the Kids Off Nauru campaign has really kick-started an important conversation, and more Australians now are aware of what's happening than at any other time, and there's no question that there's a lot of pressure coming on all sides. So where are we at? We've got a piece of legislation that has been supported by obviously the Greens and the crossbench, and that legislation is the urgent evacuation of all kids for medical care in Australia. To Australia. The problem is we don't have the support of the Labor Party on that yet, and the Labor Party have not committed. The Liberals have ruled it out point blank. The Labor Party haven't supported it. And the interesting thing now is with the changes to the composition of the lower house, with the election of Karen Phelps in Wentworth, the government doesn't have a clear majority. So we're working on trying to get the LP to support that piece of legislation so that we can get a bill passed through the Senate and put some pressure on in the lower house where there's a prospect that bill would get over the line. In the absence of getting change from Labor on that specific piece of legislation, the only thing that is on the table now is this question of a settlement to New Zealand. And again, the government has ruled that out, although I have to say they are clearly coming under a lot of pressure, not just because of the composition of the Parliament, but there are people now inside the Liberal Party who are speaking up, and that's a good thing. And it's partly thanks to the campaign of the sector. It's been very important in helping to ensure that those voices are being heard. I don't know where it will go. I mean, the honest answer to that is I don't know where it will go. I think the pressure will continue to build on the government. I think their response is we're going to do this quietly and bring kids off. But let's again be clear about this. Getting kids off Nauru doesn't solve the situation when there are still, you know, over 1,000 people on Nauru and Manus. And we need to get every single one of those people off both of those prison islands and brought to Australia, or at the very least settled somewhere and be given the opportunity to live a decent life. So I suppose I hold hope out that in the coming weeks we might see some movement. We're talking to the crossbench, we're talking to Labor, we're doing what we can to build some consensus. We're reaching out to those backbenchers within the Liberal Party. And I suppose if there's any advice I can give to you, I think the most important points of pressure here are the number of people who have spoken out, and there are 3, I think, who have put their names to comments publicly saying they want those kids off. Within the Liberal Party, there are others in the background who are also making noises. Anything you can do to support them, I think, is important. Anything you can do to get the Labor Party to support legislation that we've got that has the support of the crossbench is important. And then I think what we need to do is just to continue this campaign because it is working.